James Paterson, Taiwan has always been a flashpoint. 1996, things got very close to a conflict. But now it seems to be ramped up even further. Why are we seeing this change?
Well, to come directly back to Sulin's question, the late American poet Maya Angelou had a wonderful phrase that when people show you who they are, believe them the first time. And the Chinese Communist Party has not just shown us once who they are, they've shown us who they are in Tibet, they've shown us who they are in Xinjiang, they've shown us who they are in Hong Kong, they are showing us again who they are in Taiwan. And the ambassador at the press club yesterday showed us again who they are, and we should believe him. They are very serious when they say all options are on the table and that we should use our imagination to think about what they might do. And it doesn't require much imagination to think about what they might do. And we should believe them when they say that re-education of the 23 million free people of Taiwan is something that they have planned for after taking Taiwan. And we should treat that very seriously as Australia. I agree with everything that Pat said, and the opposition completely backs the government and the government's handling of this issue, and we completely back the 50-year bipartisan one China policy of Australia. But as a country, we need to be doing everything we can to contribute to our allies' collective efforts to discourage.
Can I just put a question to both James and Pat on this? James, you first. Was Nancy Pelosi wrong to go to Taiwan? Was that a provocative, unnecessarily provocative move?
To Jennifer's point earlier, I'm really conscious not to put Australia in the driver's seat and say that it is up to us to decide whether the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States should visit Taiwan. The Taiwanese government invited Nancy Pelosi to visit and she accepted that invitation. And it is utterly routine for congressional delegations of the US to visit Taiwan. It's also routine for parliamentary delegations from Australia to visit Taiwan. I've been on one myself. Anthony Albanese himself went on one a few years ago. And we should support that because we maintain, consistent with our One China policy, extensive unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan, and we do that because we have common interests and common values with the people of Taiwan. Jennifer made the good point that the 23 million people of Taiwan have fought very hard for the liberal democracy that they have. And while Taiwan might be historically important to China and it might be strategically important to China, for the people of Taiwan it's their home. And I think they have to be at the heart of that conversation and at the heart of the resolution of this issue.
James Paterson, that's what we broadly describe as this strategic ambiguity, that you can walk both sides of the street, if you like, that there can be a recognition of a one China, there is the People's Republic of China, but underneath diplomatic relations, there are a whole raft of relations that we have with Taiwan. Are we reaching the limits of that strategic ambiguity given the change that Damien spoke about before that we may be seeing to the status quo?
Yeah, look, headline up front, I'm not going to advocate on Q&A a change to our 50-year bipartisan one China policy. And the point that Pat makes, the really important distinction he draws is right. The Australian government's one China policy is not the same as the
one China principle.
One China principle. Yeah. We merely acknowledge the claim that they make to Taiwan. We don't recognise it. And that is a subtle but very important distinction that the Chinese government has often sought to muddy, often sought to confuse, often sought to imply that our policy commitment goes much further than it does. But on the history of strategic ambiguity, in Australia since 1972 and in the United States since 1979 with the passing of the Taiwan Relations Act in Congress, the liberal democracies in the region have supported this policy as a means of preserving the status quo. That's its purpose, because we all recognise that a change to the status quo, particularly a unilateral one and particularly one that was done by force, would be catastrophic for the people of Taiwan and for the region and for all of our interests. And so if it's been designed to discourage the people of Taiwan from a premature declaration of independence, which would probably invite a response, and it is also designed to discourage the Chinese government from initiating a change in the status quo. I have to say my observation of the last few weeks is the much greater risk of a change in the status quo is coming from the Chinese government, not the Taiwanese people. There are no moves to declare in the short or medium term independence of Taiwan, but China is showing very serious and very serious intent and very serious aggression towards Taiwan.
James Paterson, we've had instances where Chinese people have had their loyalty questioned or asked to almost pass the loyalty test when appearing at parliamentary committees. How do we differentiate between the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese people who are in China and Chinese people in Australia?
Yeah, John, thank you for raising this issue. You're absolutely right too, and I've been concerned about this for some time. One of the first public interviews I gave after I became the Intelligence Committee Chair, I said that it is both morally wrong and counterproductive for Chinese Australians to be held culpable for the actions of the Chinese government. It's also wrong to hold the Chinese people culpable for the actions of the Chinese government because they had no say in picking that government. There was no vote which brought the Chinese Communist Party to power. It's morally wrong because it's not your fault, and it's counterproductive because we want Chinese Australians to feel just as much a part of the Australian community as everyone else and to be able to fully participate in that community. And I will always defend the right of Chinese Australians or any other Australian to have the freedom of speech and to participate in public debates. Whether you share my views on the geopolitical situation or whether you completely disagree with me, you have every right to be outspoken about those issues. And to stand your point, we have to be very careful about our language. We have to be very clear that we are saying that our dispute and our disagreement is with the Chinese Communist Party or the government of China. It is not with the Chinese people, and we have to re-emphasise that at every opportunity. Because the Chinese people are rightly very proud of the achievements of their civilisation. It's an amazing culture. There's been 200 years of migration of Chinese people to Australia, and they've massively enriched our country. And so we, as political leaders, have a special responsibility to bear to make sure that Chinese Australians can participate fully in public and political and social life.
But
I want to come to James Paterson just on that. I'll give you a chance first, James, to respond to the criticism of your party's record while you're in government, and then I want to go to India.
Stan, I wouldn't say that our government got everything right in the Pacific, and I understand why the Labor Party and the union movement wanted to, before the election, criticise our record there. But now that the election's over, I don't actually think it's in Australia's national interest to pretend like nothing happened in 9 years and to talk down the very meaningful things we did with the Pacific in that period of time. I think the Pacific Step Up was a really far-sighted initiative 5 years ago under the Morrison government. We've invested incredibly in the Pacific, really refocused our international aid program to the Pacific, such that in the last budget, a record $1.7 billion of overseas development assistance was going there. And if you include other loans and grants, it was $2.7 billion investment. We are the security partner of choice for the Pacific. We were the supplier of vaccines, partner of choice for the Pacific. We helped vaccinate these countries to ways in which they could never have been able to do on their own. And that's an Australian achievement. And I don't claim that just for our government, but I don't think we should talk it down.
Can I just ask you quickly about, Sharon Burrow raised the question of India and more broadly alliances. India, as we know, does not have, under Narendra Modi, the greatest human rights record. He's been accused of trashing his own democracy, the treatment of Muslims in Kashmir, the citizenship tests that have been applied unfairly to different groups inside the country. Does it make for some awkward bedfellows when you champion India as a champion of democracy and in the Quad to push back against China? Is this the reality of pushing back against China? You have to deal with these realities.
India is not a perfect country and the Modi government is not a perfect government, but I think it's a really false moral equivalence to try and compare them to the Chinese government. It is a democracy. It has had many successful transitions of peaceful power from one party to another, and there are mechanisms through which they can examine and debate and resolve those internal issues that they have. That has not happened in China since the revolution, and it has not, there's no possibility it will happen in the future. And I don't think anything can compare to the systematic abuse of human rights that's happening in Xinjiang against the Uyghur people and other Turkic Muslims, where people like Human Rights Watch have called a crime against humanity. Other human rights bodies have said possibly a genocide. So this false moral equivalence that which is sometimes drawn between India and China, I think is actually shameful and dangerous.
Let's get to our next question. It comes from Ian Abbey.
I have a question for Senator James Paterson. In April 2022, Peter Dutton advised Australia that we should be prepared for war. If that is the case, why does Australia still export billions of tonnes of iron ore and coal to China? Should such exports be banned?
Well, the second part of that question may apply to Pat Conroy now that he's in government. But to that first part of the question, James Paterson, thank you for that question as well, Ian. Was it wrong to talk about preparing for war? Does that contribute to the sort of talk that can lead ultimately to that type of scenario?
I wish there was no prospect of war. I wish it was completely remote, but we were being dishonest with the Australian people if we told them that that was the case. And Ukraine is a very powerful reminder that we are not past history. This is not some historical thing that happened that we study in the classroom. It's the reality right now today in Europe, where we're seeing the largest ground war since World War II, where tens, potentially hundreds of thousands of lives will be lost before it's over. And so regrettably that means we do have to prepare because there are rising authoritarian...
What does that preparation mean? We've seen that the subs deal, then subs deal axed, and then a new deal under AUKUS to get nuclear-powered submarines. We know we're not at a point, the government's call for a review into defence spending, we're not at a point where we've yet developed the sovereign defence capacity to meet potentially the war that Peter Dutton was warning about.
We have more work to do, but we're in a much stronger position than we were 9 years ago.
Did we lose ground over that 9 years?
No, I think we gained ground. I mean, when we took government, defence spending had been reduced to the lowest level since World War II, just 1.56% of GDP. It's now been restored to well north of 2%, and the Labor Party in government is now saying they're going to continue that, and we are rock solid behind them in supporting them to do that. And I think it's absolutely appropriate that Richard Marles, as Defence Minister, wants to have a review of our priorities. I hope that it's a review which recommends accelerating the things that we already put in place to acquire the capability we need to make a potential adversary, particularly a much larger one, think twice about threatening Australia or our interests or our values. And that's going to mean investment in asymmetric capabilities, as we have seen the Ukrainians very successfully use against a much larger adversary in Russia.
Final question of the night comes from Jacqueline Plunkett.
Hi. If each member of the panel had $100 million to spend on the defence budget, how would each panel member apportion that budget towards cyber intelligence or equipment or personnel? And do you think the current mix is appropriate or realistic for the future?
Jacqueline, I'm not sure we'll get around to everyone with the clock running down, but cyber falls into your bailiwick, James Paterson. You've been warning about this for a long time. 100 million mightn't buy us a lot.
Yeah. I was going to say,
where would you start?
Sadly, 100 million won't get you very far, but in the most recent federal budget, we invested $9.9 billion in effectively doubling the size of the Australian Signals Directorate, so that we've got both better defensive capability in the cyber realm, but also offensive cyber capability. And the great thing about cyber capability is it can be deployed much more quickly than a nuclear submarine can. As long as you can hire the people and train them and get them in place, then they're able to have an effect from day one. And it is also an asymmetric capability. When you're thinking about a larger adversary who might be able to do damage to us in the cyber realm, and they're certainly trying to do that right now as we speak, it's important that they know that we can reach out and touch them too, that we could have an impact on them. And the scenario that everyone is particularly worried about is an attempt to disable our critical infrastructure as a prelude to a global or regional crisis, which would destabilise us internally and prevent us from projecting our power into the region to protect our friends or our allies or our values. And that investment will help guard against that risk and also make sure it's a risk for others.